Welcome back to Count Me In. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and today we're excited to have Court Watson, a partner in Deloitte's Advisory's Controllership Services practice. In this episode, we explore the evolving world of accounting and how modern accountants need to adapt to technological advancements. We'll discuss the transition from traditional reporting to data-driven methods, the importance of continuous learning, and the impactful role of AI. Court provides insights on bridging the gap between accountants and IT, leveraging AI, and future-proofing accounting practices. Join us for real-world examples and practical advice to help you stay ahead in the fast-paced accounting landscape. But before we get started, we wanted to give a quick shout-out to Deloitte's Resilient Controller podcast. It's a fantastic resource for controllers and financial executives. You can find it in your favorite podcast platform, but we'll also include a link in the show notes. So, Court, just really excited to have you on the podcast today, and we're going to be covering a lot of different things around the controllership and AI and how it's all being reshaped by everything that's happening within the industry. And I figured we could start off by just talking a little bit about AI and its effect on the controllership within organizations, because accounting and finance teams are having to learn a lot of new skills now with all these new tools coming out.
Yeah, I think if we look at generative AI, we've sort of changed the definition of AI to include many things that historically weren't machine learning. And we're sort of all bucketing them into that category. Generative AI is still in its infancy. And I think really the impact on accounting organizations today is more of a inward or internal pressure to adopt AI. And controllership, I think, is a unique space, specifically if you're a public company, right? Because there are requirements around how you use technology that don't necessarily exist in the rest of the organization. And they are an external requirement or a regulatory requirement. So I need to not only know that I have completeness and accuracy around everything that a system did, but I also need to understand at a pretty good level how the system came to the answer it did. And if you look at a lot of what's out there in AI right now, it's a little bit of a black box in understanding how the output was created, right? We're sort of relying on it to do that. And I think there's many cases where, you've asked some sort of generative AI to do something, it came out with an answer that didn't really align with what you thought.
Yeah.
But that opaqueness needs to get resolved before I think you're going to see wide adoption of AI in the accounting space. Now, I still think right now it's a really good sort of overeager assistant who can give you a first pass. But the accountant still needs to know, one, what it did, two, have the domain or subject matter expertise to be able to say, hey, that makes sense, or it doesn't, here's why. And so there's kind of two components. The accountant is going to gradually have to upskill in the sort of the AI domain. And I think understand more of an AI model uses linear regression to produce a expected outcome on, let's say, an accrual or a management estimate. The accountant needs to understand the metrics that come out of a linear regression model and whether or not that regression model is a usable model or is unreliable. And that's a kind of a new skill set for a lot of accountants. So there's going to be that upskilling over time as it comes to AI before I think you get widespread.
Yeah. Well, like you said, it's still in its infancy. And when something's in infancy, everybody sees a little infant baby. They're like, oh, how cute. But then a few years down the road, when it's a crazy toddler making a ruckus throughout the restaurant, nobody's saying how cute. They're like, oh, this is such a nuisance. So it'll be interesting to see what trajectory this new generative AI goes, because when it's in its infancy, everybody's giving each other high fives. And I think what people aren't really talking about is some of the challenges that it's bringing. But like you mentioned, the one thing about controllers, having to know why something was, and you don't always see that with the AI. Are there other challenges that are being brought up as people are getting into it?
Yeah, the skill gap is certainly there. In order to run and maintain any sort of technology, you need to have the requisite knowledge to make sure that it's updating. Finance data is still a big gap for a lot of companies.
Mm-hmm.
You're often getting transactions that are incorrect, that are incomplete, that aren't all sitting in one location, that aren't all brought together from various source systems, various inbound interfaces in one place that an AI model can sort of access and tell a narrative or tell a story from. Now, as you know, as AI gets more robust, it's going to be able to ping all the different systems and bring it all together. And that's truly, I think, what eventually the strength of these AI models will be. But today, we don't have that. How do you quantify risk of material misstatement? How do you put a number to that? Like, yes, it might not save time, but it might produce a better quality outcome. How do I justify that in terms of ROI? So that's still being figured out, is what the ROI of those use cases are.
Well, and you also still need the human interaction, like you mentioned, because we all know about the hallucinations. We've all seen the examples of them. We've seen the examples of the lawyer who created this whole speech out of it. Not that we're talking about lawyers, but there's lots of popular examples that are out there, and you still need that human aspect because, like you said, it's a really eager assistant giving a first draft.
Correct. Yes. And I will go every 3 to 5 months into one of the language models that I have access to, and I will ask it the same accounting question each time. Okay. And I always pick foreign currency because that's a topic that is pretty complex, but is very rules based. Like, if you know the rules, you can do the calculations. And the generative AI tools sound really, really smart, but they're also really, really incorrect. And that's always my fear, is someone is reliant on it, but doesn't understand the subject matter, uses that, and then produces something that results in a incorrect or inaccurate filing related to financial statements. And I think at least the conversations I have, every controllership at every company is skeptical enough that they're not at that point. So I don't think it's a pervasive risk, but I think it could happen.
And should we be worried about, the next generation of accountants that are coming up? Because, my oldest is a freshman in college, and, I know she's using a lot of generative AI to kind of help give first drafts or get ideas for things and stuff like that. And a lot of people are doing it in their works. But if people are utilizing those and not necessarily understanding having a good foundation, will we have a gap in a few years when this next generation is coming up and doing those low level jobs in accounting firms?
So I think for future generations, I think there is going to be a greater need for sort of logic, philosophy, ethics. And the reason I say that is I think you're going to see generative AI replace a lot of the menial tasks that are day to day. And the individual is going to spend less time preparing and more time analyzing. And that analysis requires sort of taking a step back, thinking about sort of the macro picture and telling that story. The way the regulatory environment is, it's never going to be, there's not people, right? You always need, you can't have generative AI sign off on a 302 certification for a financial statement. There's always going to need to be individuals. And if you look, like companies today, they don't close the books in a day. They close it in 5 or 6. And if you look at those 5 or 6, right now, there's a lot of manual work. I always say manual journal entries are a defect of your technology, right? It's just whether or not the cost benefit of resolving that defect is there. If it's something that takes 5 minutes to prepare and book, are you really going to industrialize the solution? Because it could take 6 months and like a full software development lifecycle. It's like, well, no, I'm not. I'm going to keep doing the manual journal entry. Yeah. And you sort of pick off your large ones and fix it. And those are all processes in the close. You're like, how do we fix? If I look at like accounting technology, I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't think it'll happen soon, but if someone sort of thinks of a ground up accounting technology solution around the ERP, like could there be a world where the tax provision, instead of booked on day 6 of close, after day 4, where you've fully closed the books and consolidated, is being booked on the fly with every journal entry? Because leveraging AI or leveraging technology, it's able to sort of think about, okay, what goes into the provision? How do these transactions typically impact our results? Is the technology able to consolidate on the fly versus now where you have to press a button at the end of the period and bring it all together? Like all those things, I think it'd be really cool. And I would love to be part of something where like blank slate, ground up, ERP, subledgers, closed solution from scratch, embedding current technology. I think you're seeing the large manufacturers bring that in over time. And I think that's what a lot of controllership's waiting for is the proven industrial solutions to have AI embedded in their solutions, because they know they're going to have controls around that. They're going to have a SOC report. The controllership organizations be able to say, hey, I can rely on this because it's got that right. And the industrial solutions know what accountants need in terms of validating that what happened makes sense and they understand it. And so rather than building custom and bespoke solutions like we're seeing in other domains in a company, accounting sort of like, let's see what the major players do and how they bring it into their value proposition so that we can.
That makes a lot of sense. And what you described would be really cool. But I feel like because of how things move in this industry, it would take a long time for adoption. You know,
100%.
a lot of times you see, all these cool things going up at the rest of the organization, but the accounting team is still using the same software they used 20 years ago. Why do you think that is, that there's a long adoption period, especially in the accounting and finance teams?
So I will maintain that like you cannot have agile software development as it relates to accounting technology.
Okay.
And if you want an agile solution, well, your first release has to be all the requirements, which it has to be, right? Like if I build a revenue recognition solution and it meets half of the accounting standard, well, then it's not usable. That's one piece of why it's slow. The other piece is accounting is a cost center, right? And a business has to ration its IT budget and where is it going to spend, where it thinks is most important, and totally makes sense that, customer facing revenue generating parts of the business get that priority. Totally get it. And then the other thing is, there is, and it's funny, I'll tell sort of an anecdotal story. There's a gap between how an accountant describes what they need and how someone in information technology or a developer builds a solution. And one of my colleagues did a presentation, a CPE presentation. So you get, CPE credits for your CPA license. And he had accountants write out the requirements for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He took one and he brought a loaf of bread, peanut butter, jelly, a knife, and acted out the requirements. And he ended up smearing peanut butter on top of the bag of the bread because there was never a requirement to remove the bread from the bag. And then just jamming the jar of jelly on top because there was never a requirement to open the jelly and use a knife to spread it on the bread. So it's like in an accountant's head, it's like, well, I need to book a bad debt estimate. And okay, you might verbalize 4 steps. Well, someone who has no idea how that comes about is now in charge of developing it. And they're not going to come up with a solution that meets the accountant's needs. And that just creates more manual processes on top. And so finding that balance, it's really hard to find a unicorn who knows accounting standards, but also knows how detailed requirements work, how user stories work, how testing works. And bringing those together is hard and often leads to unsuccessful outcomes that actually, kind of make controllerships, the organizations go a bit backwards. I've seen instances where the close cycle has lengthened because of new technology. And a lot of it is because companies did not rethink the processes they have and whether or not they could standardize. And then the gap between what the requirements are for the customer, the accounting organization, controllership organization, and the team that implemented the solution.
Well, and I think that really points how important it is to have good internal controls, to have good processes. And if you're going to implement any new technology, you should look at all your current processes to see how you can improve upon them when you're looking at those things.
Yes. And that ties back to controllership organizations are already really, really lean.
Yeah.
How do I spend meaningful time on that when I barely have enough headcount to do the day-to-day? So I'm trying to do the day-to-day, but also trying to do this extra incremental thing to spend meaningful time revisiting processes, redesigning controls, and producing requirements. Like, it's a massive challenge. I have seen some companies go a route that I thought was really interesting where, they baked into the budget of the initiative or the transformation effort, co-sourcing. So they would bring in a third party to backfill their accountants so their accountants could focus on that. And that to me makes a ton of sense because then you're leveraging the people with the knowledge and the expertise and they're focused on it. And sometimes what you see is your existing processes that you're, someone else is coming in to do. they'll see some things and bring in a different perspective that potentially makes it better as well.
I sometimes hate, but I also love when somebody new comes in and takes an SOP that was written, and then based on the questions they give you, realize how badly written your SOP was. And I think it's a good practice for all organizations to, at some point, bake in, hey, we need to look at our practices and make sure we're doing things efficiently, because otherwise you'll continue on and maybe never grow
Correct.
within your team.
Yeah. And, that's not only logically makes sense, but human nature is like, this is mine. I'm going to be defensive if you say it's bad, right?
Exactly.
we can make fun of our own family, but if you're on the outside, don't make fun of my family. That's totally different. And it's not much difference. If you have any pride in what you do, you're like, who is this person telling me I'm doing it wrong or should do it differently? But also, like, from a controls framework, that's good governance. Like, periodically rotating people into different roles helps you detect things that may be amiss. And that's one of the recommendations of a solid controls framework. So it's sort of dual hatting in its purpose.
It really is. Now, do you think that as some of these bigger software companies that are kind of old hats that have been around for a while, as they incorporate some of this AI features into their softwares and people start to get into it, do you think we'll start to see an ROI within those systems? Or is it just, hey, this is just a new cool tool, but I'm not really going to use it very often?
I'm going to give an accounting answer and say it depends. I think it depends on how well integrated it is, how clearly explained it is to the customer, and then how willing the customer is to change. And I think what a lot of companies, they do a disservice by not being transparent of what the limitations are or what companies need to have in place for this to work. And I think when you do, especially with accountants, it resonates much better. Like, hey, I understand it's not going to do it all, but I understand what I need to do to get to that point. The other thing is AI is still quite expensive. And you've seen situations where a license will double in cost for an AI functionality that is kind of an administrative assistant. It's like, well, do I really want to pay double for that versus just like an incremental value? So that pricing, I think, needs to get figured out. But, there are a lot of industrial solutions, both in your core finance technology plus what I call edge systems. So your reporting layer, your closed tasks, closed tools. And they're starting to look at it a lot, and they're starting to try and incorporate things. And I think it's going to be in incremental steps, because I think they're learning along the way too of what works with the customer, where the feedback is, where the friction points are, where customers, in controllership are like, hey, we can't use this because we don't understand what's happening and we can't get past regulatory questions around that. So it'll happen. I think it's going to happen in graduated steps.
Yeah, in graduated steps. That makes sense. Do you think there's steps we can be taking now to make sure that we can get over that communication gap? Because you're mentioning that we're talking about how, like, it's hard to have somebody who understands all the steps and accounting and understands how to write the stories and the processes for things to work properly, and to make sure we get all those steps down, especially for technology to work properly. Are there ideas or steps people can take to kind of get over that gap? Because that's probably the hardest part, is getting over the communication gap that's there.
Yeah. So there's a very famous technology evangelist, and he recently posted and said, hey, artificial intelligence is the gas and regulations are the brake. And my first thought was, well, the better the brake, the faster your top speed can be, right?
Okay.
If you're on a bicycle and you have no brake, are you going to go 40 miles per hour? Or are you going to go 5? Because you can't stop, right? Whereas if you can stop and control, you're gonna be able to go faster. And I think defining what that brake is, what the governance around the model is, what you actually need to see from a model to get comfortable with it, I don't think anybody spent meaningful time other than saying, this model doesn't give me enough that I can rely on it. It should be like, what do you need to rely on it? I need completeness. I need accuracy. I need to understand the inputs. I need to understand the transformation of the inputs and how it derived it. Because at the end of the day, I need to be able to back test it. I need to be able to go back and look and say, did it work? Did it do what it was intending to do? Yeah. So spending time building out that framework and what that looks like. And for right now, it's going to be company by company basis, because they are all going to have different measures of risk. They're all going to have different materiality levels, and they're going to have to work on that. The other thing is cleaning your financial data. going back, where do we have gaps? And a lot of companies are doing this as they have to and are required to modernize their finance technology, because we're kind of in a cycle of like the updates are occurring, but going through that, really thinking with a future sort of focus of like, yeah, I don't use this dimension today consistently, but I have an opportunity here to clean that, populate, because I know it's going to have value in the future. So those are the two things that companies can do now for sure.
Definitely. Do you think this is going to have a greater impact on small to medium-sized businesses? Because obviously the large organizations might have the capital to put the time in, but small organizations, you've already mentioned the controllership is very lean. A lot of finance and accounting teams have had to cut down and make it more lean and do the same amount of work. How are we going to get these extra skills and upskill and be ready for this in the midst of this fast-changing market?
It can go both ways on that question.
Okay.
So it may be easier for small to medium businesses because their systems are going to be relatively cleaner and simpler.
Okay.
At the same time, AI is expensive. And for it to be fully built into software and products, I think, the companies that produce finance technology with the capital and resources to embed AI typically don't target the small to medium sized business, right? That they're going to go up, they are the vendors for the Fortune 500 companies. So there's going to be that cost component, but I can see where the deployment will be much easier, at a small business that uses one sort of web-based ledger to track expenses and payroll and everything, and really doesn't have a complex structure of a multinational that over several acquisitions uses 4 different ERPs and 7 different customer billing systems. That just doesn't happen in a small, medium business. So the opportunity to get the most, I think, will be an easier lift. It's just an affordability.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, and you can go either way from the software company's perspective, because why not test it out with a bunch of small companies and then you can roll it out with the big ones, but then you're not doing anything complicated. So it's a give and take depending on what you're doing.
Yeah. And, a lot of what you do is proof of concepts, where you pick a component of a large business and test it. I think that would be a great idea. Find that mid-market client that's willing to be involved in those pilots and provide feedback. I think that's the best way you're going to build a solution that works for everyone.
Yeah.
It's just a totally different beast when you get a multinational that has been around forever. They have processes they've had forever that don't always align nationally. Again, systems are different all over the globe. It is a very large effort to standardize and align across multiple geographical jurisdictions.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about upskilling and this new skills that finance and accounting teams are going to need to have. Maybe we can dig a little bit more into that, because, obviously analytics, being able to analyze this data that comes out. What are the other skills that they're going to need to have, and that, accounting and finance leaders are going to need to say, hey guys, we need to get these skills. We need to make time for this.
If I think about skills that a typical accountant doesn't have today, there aren't too many that I think an accountant can be capable of. There needs to be a better understanding of data models and data structure and data tables, sort of that information science component of it.
Yeah.
Because the accountant, if you look at the applications that are coming out, they're going to be more self-service. But that self-service requires some of that requisite knowledge of like, how do I want to structure this to get the most out of it? If I want to build something in a visualization layer, I'm not in the underlying table going to create a data structure that's already a table output like the face financials. Let's just go back to a basic, like a pivot table. I think everyone knows what a pivot table is. That's already a final report structure. That is not a data table structure. And a lot of accountants think in that final report format. Well, you need to prepare the data in the data table structure so that you can then leverage your other systems and solutions and capabilities to get that. And that is actually a big gap in accountants, because they're always looking at it from balance sheet income statement format, which is a final report structure. So being able to sort of think about the data component is going to be a big piece. But accountants, again, have historically dealt with a ton of data and have worked with it to prepare reports and done it in a way where like there's controls around it. They can validate the completeness and accuracy. So they have the skill sets. And oftentimes, if you can find the right analogy, it will click in an accountant's eyes. They will always say, like, when the new revenue standard came out, there was a big concern about the material right. And I was like, well, the material right isn't much different than derivatives in derivative accounting, right? It's an option in the future to provide like some sort of benefit to a customer. And then they will blank on like, no, I don't know derivatives. I'm scared of those. I'm like, hey, have you ever like had a buddy bought like a ticket to a sporting event or a concert and invited you and said, you don't have to pay for the ticket till the day of? That's a derivative. Like, you basically entered into an agreement. You paid nothing up front and you're going to get to go in, you're going to pay for it at the end. I'm like, it's not much different. It's just, accountants just need that understanding. And then they like, there's a lot of intellectual capital in accounting, a lot of smart people. I'm confident that the people who remain curious and continually learn will be successful in this space.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's going to take us being curious to really get the generative AI and these new tools, and get them out of their infancy into something that we can maturely use within our teams. Because you think about things like data analytics, you think about things like processing automation, and you think about understanding those things in a better way. We have to be curious and kind of look into that. Do you think that we need to, all accountants should be looking and dabbling in a little bit in data science to understand those things?
Yes, 100%. And try and use it in day-to-day life. Spend time building your own ledger for your personal finances. So I'm going to download my credit card statement, download my banking statement, and think about, okay, if I was trying to put this into, there's a lot of tools that are free from a personal use perspective that'll teach you those lessons. An example I did to help understand some of the visualization capabilities of some of the solutions, I used them to track me and my college teammates' golf trip when we went to Ireland. And I set it up so in my app, I could just enter the scores on my phone and it would update and produce a graph that tracked like who was leading. And we had a complex point system. We had to incorporate handicaps, had to calculate handicaps on the fly. But it really taught me sort of the end-to-end everything I need in a way that I can then take back. Okay, if I'm going to directly access my ledger and my consolidation ledger, and I need to do some transformations on it, where that would sit, just going out and searching the web on how to do those programming languages that really are more accessible than a lot of accountants think. They're not that hard once you spend a little bit of time with them, because accountants are logical and those languages are logical. Now, you're not going to be doing really complex things or be the most advanced, but you're going to do enough to be able to add like column A to column B, or filter out only your balance sheet items in a data set. Like, you can learn it. You just have to be curious. You have to spend time on your own trying to figure it out. And those are the people who will be the most successful. And back to your point of like, what is the risk to like the next generation? Not having that curiosity and teaching those skills on your own is what's going to be the risk to each individual.
Yeah. Well, and for those who've been in the industry for a long time, yeah, it might be a little bit of a bigger curve, but it's worth your time. And it's also worth it for leaders to say, hey guys, I want you to spend the time here.
Yes, it totally. And I think, one of the things that I think probably needs to be factored into performance evaluations is formalized and structured learning. So are you spending the time each year to develop your skills? And part of that is not only saying, hey, you need to have 40 hours of learning a year, but the company providing the right learning resources. And that's not just like courses online that are video based. It is, hey, we're going to have a sandbox and we're going to have case studies. I think case studies are a great way, right? Because an individual has to follow sort of instructions, use the technologies themselves and come to the solution. And maybe that's just how I learn, but I learn best by doing. Some of the vendors have really good examples and really good documentation. And if you say, I want to learn how to bring two data sets together, you can go to the reference documentation, they have example files that you can use and learn to do it. and then you apply it to your real scenario.
Yeah. Hands-on learning is probably one of the best ways to do it, because you make live mistakes and you learn as you're going, and it's the best way to kind of get you going. Now, everybody learns in different ways, but I think it is a really effective way. And, I think, and it also goes beyond, because a lot of people in the accounting space have certifications. IMA offers a certification, but those courses are geared toward one thing. They may not get you to the other places you want to go. So you have to make sure you look beyond that as well.
Yes. And a lot of it is more theory-based. For a lot of licensing, you need to demonstrate a prerequisite amount of working time, and totally makes sense. But to have your hands in a technology, being able to do something, and what's more interesting when you can do something that's personal to you, because then you're like, I'm not only learning, but it's something I'm interested in. That's the best way. But that doesn't always happen. The other challenge is companies will deploy a solution at a production level, and if they want a sandbox, that's an incremental cost. So they have to evaluate, do we want something like a sandbox that gives our people the ability to go in and learn, and kind of like their scratch pad or somewhere to play with, knowing that it's going to have an incremental cost. And I totally get there are constraints and you have to think about that. But I do think if it's something that company believes in, we want to leverage and we want to get the most out of, it's worth that investment, because ultimately you're going to get more value out of that production solution.
Definitely. Well, Court, I think this has been a great conversation. We've covered a lot of things, and I hope our audience enjoyed it as much as I have. And I just want to thank you again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I had fun.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.